Today we're welcoming back one of our much loved guest speakers, Major Gordon Corrigan, who's travelled with us on many occasions as a guest lecturer on the Golden Eagle train, travelling through Russia or one of our Central Asian trips. And today's lecture focuses on the history of the legendary ancient trading route, the Silk Road. And as you might know, we do operate a rail journey between Beijing and Moscow through Central Asia that actually retraces some of the routes that the ancient traders once travelled. It's by far one of our most popular journeys that we do operate. And obviously, unfortunately, under the circumstances, we are unable to operate that journey this year. So I do hope if any of you are joining us today that would have been with us in September, I hope you enjoyed today's presentation and we look forward to welcoming you back next year. So that's it from me, and I'm delighted to hand you over to Major Corrigan.
Well, thank you very much, Natasha. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen, or indeed good morning, or wherever you may be. And thank you very much for logging on. When we travel on the Silk Road, we'll be following a route that's been used for nearly 2,000 years. But we won't be doing it on the back of a camel, and we won't be living on rancid dates and unhusked rice, and we won't take 2 years to do it. We shall be traveling in the wonderful Golden Eagle. We shall be eating excellent food prepared by our wonderful chefs, and we can do the whole thing in a couple of weeks. But the places that we go to and the things that we see will not have changed in centuries. Now, they say that trade makes the world go round, and certainly trade is as old as civilization. Darius the Great, Darius the First, the king of Persia between 550 and 486 BC. Now, he's the chap that invaded Europe and was stopped by the Greeks at Marathon in 490 BC. His successor, Xerxes, tried again, and he was stopped at Thermopylae in 480 BC by Leonidas and his 300 Spartans. Actually, there were Thebans and Thespians there as well, but they tend to get left out. But that's another story. The point is that Darius built himself a magnificent palace. It was regarded as one of the wonders of the age. And in his capital of Persepolis, and incidentally, if you go on the Persian Odyssey trip with Golden Eagle, we will be visiting Persepolis. It's a magic place. Now, this is all that remains of Darius's palace, because it was trashed by Alexander the Great in 330 BC. But when he built it, it was decorated with lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli, which is a precious stone, only comes from Afghanistan. You can't get it anywhere else. It's ground down and it produces a beautiful blue pigment, which is used for decoration. Very expensive, very hard to get hold of. He also used cinnabar, which again is a very expensive pigment and produces a vermilion decoration, and that comes from Kyrgyzstan. He had turquoise from Uzbekistan, and he had ivory from India. So things were moving even then. Now, if we come a little bit more up to date to Europe in round about 620, the Roman Empire in the West has collapsed. Spain and Italy and Northern Europe are in the grip of Germanic tribes. And over in the East, Byzantium, the Roman Empire in the East as was, with its capital at Constantinople, of course renamed Istanbul in 1930, that's coming under increasing pressure by the new religion of Islam. And in China, the first emperor of the Tang dynasty is beginning to consolidate his rule. In England, the Romans have been gone for 200 years. And immigrants from the Netherlands, from Lower Saxony, from Jutland and Denmark, the Anglo Saxons, they've pushed the original inhabitants, the ancient Britons, off to the peripheries, up into Scotland, over into Wales, down into Cornwall, over to Ireland. And these people, these Anglo Saxons, Originally, they'd come in as mercenaries and then were given land to settle on, brought in their families, and by a process partly of conquest, but partly just of immigration and settlement. And now there are 7 kingdoms, 7 Anglo Saxon kingdoms in England. Northumbria up in the north, Mercia, Wessex, Sussex, Essex, Kent, and East Anglia. And up in Northumbria, that's the most northern kingdom, the first Christian king of Northumbria was a chap called Oswald, and he ruled there from 633 to 642 AD. The church actually made him a saint eventually. Now we know from archaeology that in his palace he had silk hangings. Now silk only came from China. You couldn't get anywhere else, couldn't get it anywhere else. And here it is in England in the 620s. If we move a little bit further down south to a place called Sutton Hoo, this is a burial mound. We know it was built between 615 and 620 AD because of coins that were found in it. We're not absolutely sure whose grave it is. It's clearly of a man of considerable status. We think it might be the grave of King Redwald of East Anglia because he died in 624, so it may be him. But the point is that when it was excavated, it had spoons from Constantinople. It had several silver bowls from Georgia, that's east of the Black Sea. It had hangings from Syria. It had garnets from India. So we know that trade between the East and the West had thrived for centuries. But what was it all about? And why was it called the Silk Road? Well, originally, because it was all about silk. Silk was a symbol of wealth and luxury. It was the most prized and the most valuable textile of the ancient world. And indeed, it's still important today. And silk was, for a very long time, a Chinese secret. And what happens is that a certain type of moth lay eggs. The eggs hatch out into caterpillars. The caterpillars, silkworms, eat the leaves of the mulberry tree, and then they spin a cocoon. They get into the cocoon, they go to sleep, they go fat, they hatch out as moths, and the moths lay eggs, and the eggs produce caterpillars. The caterpillars eat the leaves and build themselves a cocoon and eventually hatch out as moths. Or do they? And because if you remove the material that they use to manufacture their cocoons, you get silk. Now, according to Chinese legend, in 2600 BC, at the time of the Yellow Emperor, the Empress was sitting in her garden one afternoon having a cup of tea. And from the tree above her fell a cocoon, and it fell into her cup. And as it hit the hot water, it unraveled. And the Empress said, "Oh, what is this?" And it turned out that this was silk. And it became initially a cottage industry where the women would spin the material into thread and then they'd weave it into silk. And silk became a currency within China in the areas which weren't monetarized. And that went on for some time. And later on their northern borders, the Chinese were becoming under increasing pressure from people that they called the Xiongnu, but we know them as the Scythians. Now, they were nomadic warriors who lived in what is now the Russian Far East and Siberia. They were pretty fierce people. The Persians had a go at them and failed. The Romans had a go at them and failed. And they are constantly raiding the northern borders of China, obviously long before the Roman Empire. And we know from Chinese accounts that in the year 1 BC, of course they didn't know it was BC then, in the year 1 BC, China paid the Scythians 30,000 rolls of silk, 30,000 rolls of silk as protection money. Here you are, here's this tremendously valuable material, now go away and leave us alone. Now we don't know how much silk there was in a roll, but it would have been a lot. But one is reminded of the verse in the poem, once you have paid the Danegeld, you will never get rid of the Dane. And of course, having had the silk, they thought, whoopee, and they kept coming back for more and more and more. And eventually, in 119 AD, after a long series of military campaigns, the Chinese did manage to take control of the Gansu corridor. Now, that's the red bit on your slide. It's a very fertile strip of land. And once they'd taken that from the Scythians, that allowed them access to trails and routes that led eventually into Central Asia, then into the Caucasus, and then into Europe. And that's the beginning of the Silk Road. And to begin with, it was all about silk. And very quickly, from around about 200 AD, they were starting to export silk, mainly to Central Asia. But as time went on, into the Middle East and Europe as well. Initially, they used them to buy horses for the imperial army, the imperial Chinese army. The Romans tried to ban silk because they said there's such an outflow of silver going out of the Roman Empire to buy the stuff that it's risking bankruptcy of the national treasury. It's got to stop. Of course, it didn't stop. It was simply smuggled and cost an awful lot more. Later on, it was also going to Byzantium. It was going then northwest up through the Caucasus, up to Central Asia and up to Russia, as it is now, with the Rus, the Vikings that went east, who gave their names to Russia. And people were saying, this wonderful stuff, where is it coming from? How is it made? How can we get it? Who's got it? And people, of course, were trying to steal it. They were trying to find the secret of silk. And we're told that sometime in around 600 AD, a group of Nestorian Christian monks who were on a sort of missionary mission in China stole some of the eggs and they hid them in hollow walking sticks. And they went all the way back to Syria, which is where they come from, and they started a silk industry in Syria. Now, that may or may not be true, but certainly there was a silk industry in Syria, and there still is in Damascus, or there was before the present fighting. I'm not quite sure what's happening now. But of course, it wasn't as good as Chinese silk. It was pretty low quality, but it was cheaper. And silk in China became an industry. China's population in about 800 was 50 million, far less than it is now, but it's still an awful lot. From 100 AD, they are Buddhist. Buddhism had come in along what would be the Silk Road in reverse, that had come in from the west. And the Silk Road itself starts from Chang'an. Now, Chang'an we know as Xi'an. It's the same place. And it's 700 miles southwest of Peking, Beijing. It was then the biggest city in the world. And that's where your caravans started. Everything was got together at Xi'an. The goods, the merchants, the camels for moving them, the escorts and everything else. And initially, it's all about silk. But of course, very quickly, they're also exporting high-value goods. Now, I say high-value goods because if you're going to make all that effort, you're going to go all that way, you're not going to take cheap stuff. You're going to take things that will get you a reasonable profit. So not only silk, but porcelain. The Chinese were the only people who could make porcelain, and it was very much in demand in the West. Spices, exotic spices that weren't found anywhere else. And for some extraordinary reason, dried rhubarb. Now, when I was a small boy, I hated rhubarb, and I still do. So why on earth they're exporting dried rhubarb? I cannot imagine, but they were. They were using camels. They're using the Bactrian camel. That's the two-hump chap. And they would have to leave in early spring so they get beyond the deserts before the heat of the summer. The smallest caravan would probably be about 40 or 50 camels, a couple of hundred men. Some of them were much, much bigger. 800 or 900 camels with possibly a couple of thousand men, because you need not just the merchants and the people who look after the camels, but you need an escort as well to protect you from bandits and brigands and wild animals. So the first stop after Xi'an was a place called Dunhuang, which is the left-hand red star. They started at Xi'an, which is the one on the right. Off they go up to Dunhuang. That was about 1,000 miles northwest of Xi'an, and it's just short of the last gate through the Great Wall. And as far as the Chinese were concerned, that's the end of civilization. But it was also an important pilgrimage site for Buddhists, and it was a resupply point for caravans. It was a staging post. It was where some of the animals and some of the men would change over, because not everybody would start off in Xi'an and go all the way to Constantinople. The majority of people would just go for one stage, and at each stage things would change over. So the merchants that had started off from Xi'an, once they got to Dunhuang, some of them would sell their goods to people who are coming the other way, buy goods, take them back and sell them to China. Well, after Dunhuang, the next problem was to cross the Taklamakan Desert, which is here. Now, the Taklamakan Desert, in the language of the people who live there, which is the Uyghur people, they still live there, and in their language, the desert is the go in, never come out desert, which gives you an idea of what it was like. It's west of the Gobi Desert. The temperature raises from 20 below, minus 20 centigrade in winter, to plus 40 centigrade in summer. It is absolutely dry. There is no water anywhere. There wasn't then and there isn't now. It's 620 miles across, so it's about the size of Germany. And the Silk Road went either north or south. It split. Some people did try to go through. Most of them never came out. So they went north of it or they went south of it. And the problem with the desert was that because of shifting sands, you couldn't make a map. You couldn't write a little note saying turn right at the first rock outpost, turn left at the stunted tree, because when you came back next year, the rock outcrop had gone, and so had the stunted tree, because everything changed, shifting sands all the time. So the terrain is constantly changing. So it's impossible, or was then impossible, to navigate through it. It would be a bit easier now with GPS, but still pretty difficult. Well, once they'd got north or south of the desert, the next stop would be Kashgar. And here again was a trading post. There would be again a changeover of men and changeover of animals. Kashgar is 250 miles south of Almaty, and quite a lot of our guests joined the Silk Road tour actually at Almaty rather than starting in Peking. And it was another staging post. And the sort of thing that merchants bought there to take back to China were raisins, dates, and jade. It was a great jade manufacturing place. And that would all go back to be sold in China. Well, once you left Kashgar, you then had to get over the Pamirs, the Pamir Mountains. And that's a modern photograph of the Pamirs. And you can see that even today, getting over it would not be easy. How much more difficult would it have been in the 1200s, the 1300s, the 1400s? The terrain's against you, the weather's against you, and of course it's riddled with bandits only too happy to cut out a small caravan and loot the products. It was known at the time as the route of bones, which gives an example of how difficult it would have been. And they went through what is now Kyrgyzstan, up northwest to Tashkent. Once they got to Tashkent, this is now just inside Uzbekistan. And Tashkent was the meeting point of the Persian and the Chinese worlds. Off to the east, that was the Chinese world. To the west, it was the Persian world. To the west, Zoroastrianism. To the east, Buddhism. And this is where Chinese officials would go back to China. Now, each large caravan had one or two Chinese officials, government officials, who traveled with it. The smaller caravans tended not to have an official with it, but they would still be checked at various stops. And the purpose of these officials was to make a note of what have you sold and what did you get for it, what have you bought and what did you pay for it, so that when they returned to China, they could work out the customs duties and the taxes that would be levied on the particular merchants. The sort of thing they'd buy in Tashkent was metal. It was a great metalworking center. Glasswork, they produced particularly good glass, and musical instruments. That would all go back to be sold in China. Now, I mentioned before, I think, that these areas, the places we now call Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, and the rest, they were originally part of Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire. And when the empire got too big to be ruled by one man, then the empire was divided. So the areas that we're passing through were independent or semi-independent khanates, initially all ruled by descendants of Genghis Khan, but really by the middle of the 18th century, many of them were no longer relatives, and they'd got their position by assassination, murder, or whatever. Well, then in the 19th century, with Russian expansion down to the south, then these areas all came under the rule of Russia. But a lot of the old buildings had started to fall apart. The Khans didn't have the money to keep them up, and the Russians weren't terribly interested. And then during the Russian Civil War, 1918 to 1920, there was a brief period of independence where these khanates were no longer part of Russia, they were independent. Didn't last for very long. Once the Russian Civil War is over, 1920, 1921, then the USSR regains control over the area. And initially weren't terribly interested. But then later on, officials in the USSR, particularly Stalin, decided that these areas should be restored. Now, when Stalin, in the late 40s, was restoring the Romanov palaces, somebody said to him, "Why are you restoring the glory of the Romanovs?" And Stalin said, "I'm not restoring the glory of the Romanovs, I'm restoring the glory of the people who made the glory of the Romanovs." And they also did the same thing down in Central Asia. So as I said, I think when I was talking about Genghis Khan, these buildings, part of them are original, the rest is restoration, but they've been restored very sympathetically. So what we're seeing is what people saw hundreds of years ago. Obviously, there's a little bit of difference, they're a bit cleaner, and there aren't so many beggars around, but essentially we're seeing what they saw. The other important thing in Tashkent was that it was the center of the horse trade. The Tashkent horse sales were terribly important. And these, again, of course, are Mongolian ponies. They were said to be the best horses in the world. Well, they were certainly the best horses in the East, and they are the ones that Genghis Khan and his successors conquered the whole of the known world. And Tashkent was the main center of the horse trading business. And then on to Samarkand. And this was another staging post, another trading post. There was a mint in Samarkand, which produced coinage. And Ibrahim bin Yaqub, who was a 10th century merchant who traveled all around Europe and left an account of his travels. He was a Sephardi Jew. And he said that when he was in Mainz in Germany, or what is now Germany, he found that trade was conducted using coins minted in Samarkand. So that's how far the money was traveling. There was a bit of a problem after Samarkand, but because between Samarkand and Pokhara, Freudian slip, Pokhara's in Nepal, between Samarkand and Bokhara, this was the most dangerous bit of the journey in terms of brigands and bandits. The local Khans tried to keep order as best they could, and you can see the severed heads on poles around this building. which was intended to discourage other thieves, and it didn't necessarily work terribly well. But it was important that once you left Samarkand, that you had an escort with you that could keep the bandits away. That building, by the way, has been restored. We will see it. We will go into it. The only difference is that there aren't so many beggars around. In fact, there aren't any, and the severed heads have disappeared. Well, off we go. I've put this on a modern map so that you can see where we are. We've gone off from Bukhara, and our next stop, we've got to Bukhara, and again it's been restored, and again this was a staging post. Some of the camels will change over, some of the men will change over, there'll be things bought and things sold. And then the next stage is Merv or Mary, it's the same place. There's not much of ancient Merv left. It's one of the exceptions on the Silk Road, but it's still a very interesting place, and it's still worth going to have a look. It's in what is now Turkmenistan. Well, it's here at Merv that the Silk Road splits. One route goes south to Herat, and Herat is actually now in Afghanistan. It was then part of Persia. And that's where lapis lazuli that I talked about, that's where that came from. This brilliant blue pigment that was very much in demand. Huge trading center at Herat. And then from Herat, it went on to Damascus, and then to Constantinople, and then on into Europe, and ultimately to King Oswald of Northumbria. The other route goes north. It goes up between the Caspian and the Black Sea, up to the land of the Rus, along the rivers, particularly the Volga, and trades up there. It's also where they change over their animals. The two-hump chap, the Bactrian, he stops and everything is cross-loaded onto the dromedary, the one-humped chap. So the Bactrian is the camel of Eastern Asia, and the dromedary is the camel of Western Asia. Don't ask me why. I've asked my veterinary friends what would happen if you bred a Bactrian camel to a dromedary. And they say, we're horse vets, we don't know anything about camels. So I have no idea what would happen. If anybody does know, I'd be fascinated to know. But for some reason, the dromedary was the camel of the West, and the two-hump chap didn't go any further than that. Well, of course, the Silk Road wasn't just silk. It was originally silk, of course. But it wasn't just trade either. Armies went along it, east to west. Religions, philosophies. And of course, all this went both ways. Alexander the Great went west to east in about 330 BC. Now, he never got into Central Asia. He got as far as northern India. He couldn't get across the Indus River, so he started to go home, and he died in Babylon in 323. Genghis Khan, Temujin, he came along east to west in the 1220s. His descendants went along the Silk Road. They got to Moscow, they got to Poland, they got to Austria, they got to Hungary. The plague, Black Death, starts somewhere in China, we don't know where. It travels along the Silk Road, presumably with the merchants who traveled along it, because people said that the plague moved at the speed of a walking man. It got into the Crimea on the north of the Black Sea. From the Crimea, it got to Sicily, from people fleeing it in a boat to Sicily, from Sicily to Marseille, and of course, eventually it gets into England in 1348. We now know it killed between 50 and 60% of the population. I know at school we were told 30%. We now know from archaeology and accounts that weren't available then that it actually killed far more than that. But of course, that's a different story. Now, Europeans had been to China in the Middle Ages, but they didn't write about it. And the first European to actually visit China and then write about it was Marco Polo. Marco Polo was a merchant. He was a Venetian merchant family, and his father and his uncle used to trade into what is now Russia every year. And they would trade as far as Kazan and Samara. And one year they were trading along the Volga when they met some Silk Road traders. And they said, oh, where have you come from? What are you doing? What's China like? So they went off to China and they got there and they met the emperor, Kublai Khan, who was a grandson of Genghis Khan. Now, Kublai had never seen Europeans before, so he was very interested in them. And he made them promise to come back next year and bring some trade goods with them. So the following year, taking the 17-year-old Marco with them, they took a letter from the Pope. They went via Jerusalem. They left in 1271. They got as far as China. They met Kublai Khan, who was very taken with young Marco. He thought Marco was a bright young boy and he could use him. And he appointed Marco Polo as his foreign embassy, his emissary. And Marco traveled all around the Chinese empire. He traveled to Burma, traveled to India, traveled to what is now Vietnam, about the emperor's business. We don't know what languages he could speak. He would probably have learnt some of the local languages, but otherwise he'd be accompanied by interpreters provided by the court. And he came back in 1295. He'd been away for 24 years. And then the following year, in 1296, there was a war between Genoa and Venice. And Marco was captured and he became a prisoner of war. And while he was a prisoner of war, he dictated his story, which was then copied and copied and copied in many versions. It got into European literature. It got into Asian literature. And the question really is, was it true or not? Because opinion is divided. Was this a factual account of a journey that ends up in China and then comes back? Or is it fiction? Or is it something garnered from talking to people who perhaps did go to China? Well, if we look at it, he describes how ill he was going across the Pamirs. And from the description of his illness, which he gives, it's quite clear he had altitude sickness. Now, the Pamirs are 20,000 feet high. And the only place he could have got altitude sickness was the Pamirs. There's no European mountain that's high enough to give you altitude sickness. He talks about going through the Taklamakan desert, and he describes what it was like and how difficult it was. When he gets to China, he talks about porcelain. Now, porcelain by now was known in Europe, coming from China, but nobody could make it in Europe. And he talks about how the Chinese made it. He talks about paper money, which wasn't used anywhere else, only in China. He talks about coal, which the Chinese used as a fuel. Now, coal was known about in Europe, but it wasn't used as a fuel. He talks about gunpowder. Now, gunpowder was unknown in Europe. China was the only place where it existed. So that would seem to indicate that he actually was there. He did go there. But his detractors say, well, hang on. He doesn't mention the Great Wall of China. Now, you couldn't possibly go to China without seeing that. And it was so enormous, he must have commented on it, and he doesn't comment on it. Therefore, he wasn't there. Well, hang on. The Great Wall of China was really no longer needed. There were Mongols on both sides of the wall now. So the initial purpose of the wall has gone. And the wall had been allowed to fall into disuse. And people took stones away from the wall to build their houses. It was rebuilt much later. So if Marco did see a tumble down wall, there's no particular reason why he should comment on it. But what about foot binding? Now, nobody else in the world bound the feet of their women. What happened with Chinese women was that baby girls had their feet bound so the feet couldn't grow. So when they were adults, their feet were tiny little things. It must have been incredibly painful. and very difficult to walk. And the Chinese thought that this made their women's walk very attractive, everyone to his taste. So surely Marco would have spotted that and because it was so unusual, would have commented on it. Well, not necessarily, because the Mongols didn't do it. The Mongols didn't bind their women's feet. And he's operating in a Mongol court. When he travels around the empire, he's moving with Mongol officials, with a Mongol escort, and he may not have noticed it. Or if he did, he wouldn't have thought anything of it. So personally, my own opinion, for what it's worth, is that he really did go to China, that the account is a genuine account of his journeys. Even if he's added bits, or subsequent writers have added bits from other people who were there, it's still a very interesting account of the Silk Road in the 13th century and China in the 13th century. So the Silk Road, well, perhaps it's the first step in globalization. It was certainly a conduit for trade, for invasions, for conversions, for disease. The Romans couldn't stop it. The Ottomans tried and they failed. Now, of course, the Silk Road is entirely connected by rail. And the only obstacles are ideological, perhaps, and bureaucratic. Think how many hours you spent filling in forms to get your visa. So that's a quick romp on the Silk Road. I very much hope that in due course you'll travel with me along the Silk Road. It's a fascinating area, great fun, and thank you very much indeed for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Major Corrigan, for that. I think to try and condense the history of the Silk Road in such a short space of time is a very difficult challenge, and I think you did that perfectly, to be honest. I think it was a great insight into what obviously you would learn yourself by travelling on the Silk Road, so thank you for that. We have got some questions that have come through whilst you were talking, so it actually leads on from something you've just mentioned. Obviously, now to travel Silk Road, especially if you do it by rail or if you do it by road, you obviously have to have certain visas, you've got to cross certain borders, and there's all of those sort of challenges you come across. And one of the questions was, in those times, were there tolls or taxes you had to pay for entry, exit, or transit as you're going through various countries, or were there such borders, or was it not strict in that sense?
When it was part of the Mongol Empire, of course, there were no taxes, no tolls. It was free trade throughout the empire. Afterwards, when the empire was divided, and really by the sort of late 18th century, and certainly by the middle of the 19th century, when the Russians are expanding south, it was inhabited by fierce, thoroughly unpleasant, pretty undisciplined tribes who would certainly tax you, but tax was what they could get out of you. So there was you didn't know how much you were going to have to pay. So if you traveled in that area, you had to make jolly sure that you had an escort with you to protect you, or you disguised yourself as a tribesman. Now that isn't as daft as it sounds, because all these different tribes, there are a number of different races. So you could get away with it as a European. You were just a bit fairer skinned than the other occupants. So you either disguised yourself and spoke one of the languages, or you had an escort. But yeah, I mean, it was now it's not a problem, but then it was jolly difficult passing through. And indeed, I think in my next talk, when I start talking about the Great Game, we will indeed be talking about how people operated in that part of the world.
Definitely, I think that's one of the fascinating things as you showcase just how difficult it was to cross. It wasn't an easy feat by any shape of imagination. So I think that's what so many people think is fascinating about the history. And a similar question that came through earlier on was when you were talking about, obviously, when they were crossing the desert, and obviously you couldn't create a map because of the changing sands and the climate there. Did they have any maps for navigation at all, or how did they navigate through the same route?
The way they navigated essentially was in asking people. You ask a local, and he will take you as far as he knows, and then you pick up another local, and he'll take you as far as he goes. Now, of course, within probably 20 or 30 years, there'd been enough merchants who'd been along the route, and you hired one of them. You hired a guide, and he would take you. The desert, a friend of mine actually did cross the desert with 2 camels. And one of the great problems he had was that one of the camels got constipated. And the local guide said, not a problem, I know how to deal with this, and got a poker and put it in the fire, got the red hot poker and whacked it up the camel. And that sorted it out. I don't recommend it, by the way. I don't recommend it for humans. Yeah, that's right. That's what he did.
Well, yeah, that's not, but I wouldn't recommend anyone trying that now. I think that's quite a brutal way of doing something. But like I said, yeah, it solves the problem at least. But thank you very much for answering that, because that is a really interesting question in that sense. We have another question about the Silk Road and how it was used, obviously, for commerce, and how long it was used. So how many years was it a legitimate trading route in that sense?
It was a trading route really from about 200 AD. Once the Chinese had pushed the Scythians back and were able to get to the start of those trails. And I suppose it really stops being a sort of recognized route probably once the USSR has got hold of the area. Really after the Communist Revolution, or certainly after 1920-21, when the Civil War's over and the USSR have re-established control of the Romanovs then you couldn't travel along it, at least not without a great deal of difficulty and doing a lot of talking and a lot of passing of brown envelopes and that sort of thing. Very, very difficult. Once the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, of course, absolutely no problem at all. And actually, from the 80s onwards, when the Soviet Union was starting to relax a bit, then you could do it with great difficulty, but you could do it. Now, of course, we have absolutely no problem. I mean, you cross a border, a rather smiling chap comes along in a scruffy uniform and says hello, always looks in your bathroom, because they don't have our sophisticated Golden Eagle type bathrooms, and they're terribly interested in that. So they have a look and they want to see how the taps work. And a big smile, stamp your passport, and that's it. I mean, there's absolutely no problem at all. In fact, for not all, I think Kazakhstan, you don't need a visa. Some you do, well, it depends what nationality you are, but if you're British, I think Kazakhstan, you don't need a visa, others you do. It depends on your own nationality. It's a lot of form filling in to begin with. But once you've done that, getting the visa is no problem. And crossing the border is absolutely no problem at all. And I've known people who've driven it, and again, no problem. They're terribly interested in European cars, of course, but you can do it. But I recommend doing it on the Golden Eagle. Food's much better.
I think there's a question actually has just come through about visas. So you've already answered some of that, just about obviously the visa process. And like you said, it can be time consuming filling in the forms initially, but once you have done that initial thing, and you can use visa agencies, you don't have to do it all independently. But once you've done that, it's well worth the effort, isn't it, once you've got through? Yeah,
I would recommend to anybody to use the agent. I think any visa is the agent that we use. It costs you a little bit more, but frankly, it's an awful lot less hassle, because they will go to the embassies and hand in your passport and pick them up and that sort of stuff. So I would do it. You can do it yourself, but save yourself the hassle. Use the agent.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just if anyone's interested on what visas are required at the minute, obviously things may change before the next Silk Road departure we do, but we have a section on our website where you can actually see, depending on your nationality, we put like the major nationalities on there, and you can see what visas are required for each journey. So that's under the My Trip section of our website if you wanted to for more information on that. But as I said, that could change as we go on. But we have some questions specifically about the journey itself, so I'll just quickly answer a couple of those. We've got a question about how many shorter Silk Road trips we are doing next year, and we do. And the short section, as Major Corrigan pointed out, would be starting in Almaty in Kazakhstan and then finishing in Moscow. And we do that twice per year, so in April and in October, as part of the larger journey. So guests will start in Beijing, and then some guests will join in Almaty. But it's the same journey, it's just they join slightly later. So yeah, both of those are available to book for next year. But the Silk Road tour is actually incredibly popular. So Gold Class, for example, and Imperial Suites have sold out at the moment, but Gold Class is very limited, and we still have some Silver Class available if you're interested in travelling with us next year. So that's, I think, answered that one. Again, someone asked about air-conditioned cabins, and obviously if you do travel with us in October or April, where it is, some of the countries can get quite warm, and we do have air conditioning in all of the compartments, and you've got a remote control as well, so you can control that, and obviously how cold or how warm you want your cabin, so you're in control of that. We have a question about relating to your lecture, so I'll go back to you, Major Corrigan. They've just asked, the modern Central Asian countries were artificially made by the USSR, and are there still conflicts within the countries because of the different tribes or ethnic groups?
Yes, there are. It's actually the subject of a separate lecture, so I'm not going to hold your attention for the next 40 minutes. But to say yes, there are. There are problems about water, a shortage of, and of course, increasingly people want more and more water. There are problems particularly in Kazakhstan, not the bit of Kazakhstan we go through, but there are parts of Kazakhstan where you wouldn't want to be in it for too long because you'll start to glow in the dark, because it was used by the Soviets as their testing ground for nuclear weapons and nuclear and biological weapons as well. But that's further north in Kazakhstan, so we're not going through that area, so fear not. But that is a problem of cleaning that up. There are problems of modern slavery. There are problems of drug smuggling, particularly from Afghanistan, because Afghanistan, of course, south of Uzbekistan, so go through there. So there are all sorts of problems. There aren't so much. I mean, one of the good things the Soviets did, they couldn't abolish religion completely. They'd have liked to have done, but they couldn't. Islam was just too strong. What they did was they abolished fundamentalism. So although the countries we pass through are Muslim, they're sort of Church of England Muslim, if you know what I mean. They're very liberal Muslim. I mean, they drink. They don't pray 5 times a day. They don't make their girls cover up. The girls wear their national dress. Uzbek girls are very pretty, actually. So it's a very liberal Muslim country. You can get bacon, for example, in the morning. Now, they'll keep it in a separate oven because it's supposed to be cooked differently. But if you're in a hotel in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and you want bacon with your fried eggs, not a problem. So from that point of view, it's very easy. I mean, unlike some countries, I mean, Iran, for example, no alcohol, absolutely no alcohol. You have to cover your hair if you're a lady. But that's not the case along the Silk Road. There's no problem at all. There's no problem with alcohol or anything like that.
And I think that leads, like I said, nicely on to just to let everyone know that if they're interested in joining the follow-up lecture to this one, which is on the Great Game, which was obviously the rivalry between Great Britain and Russia in Central Asia, then that will be taking place on the 30th of July, so in a few weeks' time. So if you'd like to register for that, you can do on the website, because I think that'll be another fascinating lecture to join. So we're very much looking forward to that. And I think just a couple more questions before we finish. Just asking about the trip itself and if we offer Spanish-speaking guides on board the train. And we do have Spanish-speaking guides available on all of our journeys. It's an additional cost. Obviously, all of our journeys are English-speaking, but if you do have you do have a need for a Spanish speaking guide, then that can be purchased as an additional add-on to your journey. But I hope that answers that question. We're getting a lot of other comments, so I really appreciate everyone joining us tonight, and thank you again to Major Corrigan. I think it's another fascinating lecture, and we're really, really looking forward to the next one on the 30th of July. Thank you very much, and have a lovely day or evening wherever you are, and we hope to see you again soon.